smallmouth in the Milwaukee metropolitan area. A lot of people, are kind of more familiar with probably the Wisconsin or something like that. But we really do have a prolific fishery just north of Milwaukee. So to give you a bit of an introduction, I am a Wisconsin native. I was born and raised here, but kind of quickly moved out. I became a professional skier at age 13. Was quickly banned from every ski area within about an hour of my house, because the insurance that the ski hills had wasn't into a young kid doing backflips. So in fairness, yeah, it was time for me to move on. Took a wee break from skiing after the 2002 Olympics, and moved to New Zealand for quite some time. And yeah, became a two-time Olympian, actually. Um, I coached both the US team in Sochi, as well as the principal director and head coach of the Australian team in Pyeongchang. Um, so yeah, kind of, I've always been somebody that followed their passions, so to speak. I graduated from Marquette with a degree in performance enhancement psychology, which obviously was quite beneficial going into coaching skiing and something that was extremely scary. I'm a published author. I wrote research for a number of years. Uh, and living in New Zealand and yeah, being a little footloose and fancy free, I've filled up 4 passports. I've been to about 74 countries. So that was, kind of, yeah, one of the things that I'm probably most passionate about is traveling, and got to do it with a fly rod in my hand. I'm a New Zealand citizen, actually, as well. Having lived there for so long, it seemed like the logical thing to do. And I also in New Zealand could not find a job. So I started my own fashion label, um, which I know probably seems quite ironic for a bit of an outdoorsman, but it was something that I was quite into. Um, but after the Pyeongchang Olympics, I decided that I'd do a 10-week road trip across the West. I fished in 10 different states and put my feet in about every piece of water that I could possibly want to. After that, I got an opportunity to move to Costa Rica for 2 months and chase big tarpon, which might have stolen my soul a little bit. But yeah, one of my biggest passions certainly is smallmouth. And oh, sorry. Oh, I'm blowing this. Oh, that's fine. No one wants to see me skiing anyway. Um, uh, but basically, I've really embraced kind of the multi-species aspect of fly fishing. Basically, if it swims, I want to catch it on a fly rod. So I'm up to about 120 different species on the fly rod, and without a doubt, tarpon is my yeah, stole my soul a little bit. But here locally, albeit having amazing trout water in this state, I've really embraced smallmouth for a lot of reasons, and we're going to kind of get into that. Oh, I've got fat fingers. Sorry about that. So smallmouth bass characteristics. I think one of the things that if you understand certain aspects of smallmouth, you can really figure out the formula as to how to fish for them and catch them consistently. And as a guide on the Milwaukee River that's not dam controlled, we are subject to Mother Nature. So one of the biggest things is that, you know, we have to go out when that river is humming at 1800 CFS and do the same thing when it's out down to 100. So whether it's high water or low water, we've kind of figured out the formula of how to catch these fish quite consistently. One of the biggest things to understand about smallmouth is that they're ambush predators, and they do the vast majority of their feeding with their eyes. So they hide themselves, very akin to snook in saltwater, in the sense that they're waiting for a fish to make a mistake and come in their path, and then they come out and strike. Anybody that's ever caught a smallmouth kind of knows the surprise of this fish turning on a fly or a lure quite abruptly. Having said that, they're lazy fish. Most fish are. They're constantly conserving energy. So if that's one of the things that you can understand about smallmouth, they're in places that they don't have to waste a lot of energy to get food. They're very different than trout in that way, that they're kind of waiting for food to come to them, where these ambush predators are really actively seeking food, which makes them so eager for the fly. Now, they do like shade, structure. I mean, that's kind of one of the obvious places that they're always hiding. Um, but having said that, we're in a drought at the moment, and we're finding them mid-channel as well. So that's kind of one of the things that we'll cover today. So yeah, one of the things about a fly is that it's most productive if it can create some kind of turbulence, because smallmouth bass have ears and a lateral line. Um, the inner ear detects very high frequency noises, whereas their lateral line is more akin to the low frequency noise of like a popper or something like that, right? So a lot of the flies that I've designed for our water oftentimes have either rattles in them or have deer hair that will push water and create turbulence. Now that's extremely critical to understand when we're thinking about particularly dirty high water. You know, how do you get to these fish in high water when visually they can't see the fly? So they may be hiding in structure, but if you can create enough turbulence, they'll make a move on that because of their lateral line. Bass also have teeth. Anybody that's had a great day bass fishing knows about bass thumb. But these teeth aren't like pike, they're more like sandpaper. So it's really just to hold their prey and digest it effectively. And that's one of the other things that we'll go to when we talk about how to kind of present a fly to a smallmouth bass. Now, having said that, I think one of the coolest things about them is that they're very intolerant of pollution. So you're oftentimes finding these fish in areas that are quite clean. And that was one of my biggest surprises, having grown up in Wisconsin and moved out. The Milwaukee River had this terrible reputation for being extremely dirty. But having said that, There have been a lot of organizations that I've partnered up with to do river cleanups. Milwaukee River Keepers has up to as many as 500 people doing river cleanups. And yeah, it's pretty remarkable. So one of the other characteristics is that they're very temperature dependent. So they like warm oxygenated water. When the water gets too cold, you have to fish for them in a very different way. It's a much more subsurface game than something that may be neutrally buoyant or closer to the surface. They're in this very hibernative state once that water hits a critical temperature. So last year, because the Milwaukee River is actually open all year long to bass, which is awesome, I was able to catch smallmouth every month of the year, including January, February, and March. So that was a ton of fun. One of the other cool things is that I've deliberately put a lot of pictures in here because they camouflage themselves in a very interesting way, predicated on the substrate of the bottom. You know, if it's this sandy bottom, you're likely to catch a very light, non-camouflaged fish because that's where they are the least susceptible. When you have a rocky bottom, they're going to look something more akin to this. So yeah, pre-spawn time is one of my absolute favorite times to go after these fish because they are so eager for big flies. They're getting ready to kind of do their thing, so to speak. And they're constantly on the prowl for food because they go into a post-spawn hibernative state. They've spawned, they're extremely tired, they're lethargic. But one of the beauties of the Milwaukee River is that we have different temperatures. It's a 103-mile long river. So we can go and target, you know, pre-spawn fish and post-spawn fish in the same day, you know? So when they're on their beds, because this is what I do for a living, I tend not to take them off of them. You know, if you see them and you're able to sight fish these fish during their spawning period, my recommendation personally is to not really fish for those fish. I've had clients on the boat that have been like, oh, there's one right there, but I'm like, yeah, but it's gonna result in 50 more fish in this river. So why would we inherently take it off of its bed? Um, Summertime is also a great time to catch them. They're extremely eager for the fly because food is so abundant. And they tend to be more in riffly oxygenated water as opposed to where they may be during that spawning or post-spawn period, or as well as in the fall. Now, in the fall, they're looking for that last big meal of the year, and I can't tell you how many times I've been musky or pike fishing and ended up catching a very large smallmouth on a fly that large. You know, it just so happens that yeah, they're not too afraid of much. Now we're going to get into the gear a little bit because one of the things that I noticed with either people on the boat or working in fly shops is they oftentimes go at the smallmouth with suboptimal gear. Now, I prefer saltwater 7 and 8 weights for a number of reasons. you can cast a lot farther, you can cut through the wind, and you can throw a lot bigger of a fly without so many false casts. I know a lot of people have seen a river runs through it and it looks beautiful, but it's literally, you know, a couple false casts and you should be able to knock it out 50 feet off to the bank. We don't need to do that kind of, yeah, kind of constant shadow casting as people are more accustomed to with trout. Um, and one of the other reasons I like 8 weights in particular um, is that they can make a longer, more accurate cast, and you're able to fight that fish a lot easier, making it as seamless as possible um, to land that fish and subsequently release it. I do run a catch and release program on all smallmouth because, again, yeah, you want to catch them again and let them grow, because that 15-inch smallmouth that you caught a couple of years later may be a trophy. So one of the biggest things about the gear is fly lines itself. All right. Now, what I've done is stolen a little information from Scientific Anglers. They make great lines. This is your typical trout line. Now, a trout line is measured within its first 30 feet. All right. And what that causes, you can see there's not a ton of weight near the head. It has a long presentation section. It's made to make a very delicate cast, whereas I prefer shooting lines. Now, what you can see here is that the vast majority of this weight is located within the first probably 16 to 18 feet. Now, what that allows you to do is to load that rod more effectively and make fewer false casts. Because anybody that's gone fly fishing for a day with a trout line knows that you can fatigue yourself quite quickly. And one of the things I'll be doing, if anyone's interested, I'm happy to give casting lessons later. And yeah, the line makes such difference. Now, I particularly do for smallmouth river fishing. Now, one of the things um, with smallmouth is to constantly change depth. So I use a lot of sink tip lines as compared to full sinking lines, because if you're not in a boat and you're waiting, a sinking line will just drop to your feet. And then you're picking up and picking up and picking up, and it's no fun at all. It also creates a belly once you've cast, because that line sinks and goes with the flow of the river. So you're able to mend and control that fly so much better with a sink tip line as compared to a full sinking line. And if anyone's ever in a fly shop and they wonder what IPS stands for, it's just inches per second. So that refers to during that tip section, which is generally from 18 to 14 feet, that is how fast that tip will sink every second. So if it's 3 IPS, it's going to sink 3 inches every second. Now, not everybody has kind of the luxury that I do to carry a bunch of lines and a bunch of rods. You can get away with that with something called poly leaders. Now, a poly leader is most effective between 4 and 7 feet. And then you just attach with a loop-to-loop connection a piece of tippet on the end. So that'll help the fly get down. And that's one of the things that we'll cover with flies. And kind of demystify a little bit about fly selection. I think I've seen it's almost kind of a guide trick to switch flies when things aren't going right. I would say that, yeah, you change flies for depth, and if you're not having success in a certain part of the water column, you need to change that, as opposed to just changing colors. Albeit being visual predators, you do have to get that fly close enough to that fish to be successful. Um, the other thing, so at the end of a fly line, you have your leader, and uh, a lot of companies have come out with very species specific leaders. Now, a bass leader is much different than a trout leader. So a trout leader is much thinner in its butt section and tapers almost immediately to give that delicate presentation of a dry fly. But that's not necessarily what we're interested in when it comes to streamer fishing. We're looking for a much larger butt section that extends further and then tapers down into its class. And the reason for that is that it's more of an extension of the fly line as opposed to something that you need to generate so much line speed to get turnover. And turnover is absolutely critical. You know, I can't tell you how many times I've been in the boat with a client and gone, I need 3 more feet, you know, if we're kind of working banks and structure. And leaders do make a big difference in that. So we've got a variety of different flies, and you can break them down into basically 3 groups. You've got your top water flies, which are super cool and fun to fish with, but they really only work certain times of years. They often imitate frogs or mice or anything that is a huge source of protein that doesn't bite back. Neutrally buoyant flies, they tend to swim within that first 3 to 6 inches of the water column, um, and great summertime fly. And then you have your weighted flies that are going to imitate sculpins, crayfish, hellgrammites, anything else that may be much, much deeper within the water column. And we'll get into that. Now, I think anybody that's gone to a fly shop, they see this myriad of flies that catch fly fishermen and not necessarily fish. If you were to choose 2, you could go out with a woolly bugger and a clouser minnow and have an unbelievable amount of success. But having said this, I'm going to show some of my go-to flies. So for top water, we're talking kind of poppers, deer hair bugs that, again, create turbulence. They're appealing to that lateral line. Oftentimes we see with top water flies, these fish will chase from great distances. Um, Neutrally buoyant flies. I've got to give it to Blaine Chocolate. He did an amazing job with the Game Changer. It has a ton of movement. It moves water. But these neutrally buoyant flies are more often imitating bait fish as opposed to anything else. Then you have your weighted flies. Those are going to imitate your crayfish, your sculpin, and other bait fish that at certain points of the year may be lower in the water column. So those are kind of some of my go-tos. As far as like which flies to use and when, I think one of my rules of thumb is because they are such visual predators. I don't know what I did to this. I might have broken it. Sorry. I might turn this off. I think there's just, sorry, this is going a bit haywire on me. Just a touch. Maybe I got too close. Yep. Is it working? If it's not, I have a loud voice. I can. Yeah, not a problem. So, because they are visual predators, in low, clear water, you want something that's quite vibrant. I use flashy flies, often white bait fish, using a lot of flash because you want them to be able to see it, you know? Whereas in low stain, turbid water, those fish are looking up. So a darker profile does much better at casting a shadow. Let's say we have low, like, turbid water. They're looking up, and a black or olive fly is going to do much, much better at inciting the bite as opposed to something else. And again, when that water gets stained, you want something that has a rattle, that has something to move water, has that deer hair head, that's going to push water and appeal to that sensibility of that lateral line. And one of the things that I think a lot of people ask is, yeah, which flies do I use and when? And a lot of times I don't change flies for fly's sake or pattern's sake. I do it for depth or size and profile, right? So in the spring, bass super aggressive, right? We're using big flies, 4 to 6 inches. You're really throwing some meat at them because they are so eager. Post spawn, I've found that weighted flies work a little bit better because they are more lethargic. They're in a kind of pseudo hibernative state. And we downsized that profile a little bit. Early summer, and where that food source is becoming quite abundant, one of the tricks I've found is really downsizing on the profile of the fly, because again, their food source hasn't really matured so much yet that they're looking for super big meals. And in the fall, it's on. I mean, they will chase musky flies. Yeah, this is one of the pictures I was talking about. That's a musky fly that literally is half the length of, an 18-inch smallies body. So where to find them in various conditions? Now, as a guide, I have a little bit of an advantage because I'm on the water a ton, and I don't have the luxury of having this dam that keeps it at a consistent flow at all times. So one of the things that I've found during this drought period is that we have low clear water. Now, in low clear water, you want to burn that fly as fast as you can, right? Because you don't want to give that fish the opportunity to see your leader, to see the fly and go, phew, that's not real, So you're moving it extremely quickly and you're getting that bite almost instantaneously. So in higher fast water, this is something that took a little bit to figure out, was that you fish on the inside of the bends, because these are extremely lazy fish. They don't want to be on the outside of the bend, if a river were to be curved like yay, because that water on the outside is moving much, much quicker than the water on the inside of the bend. you're going to have way more success hitting banks on the inside in very high, fast water. Now, in slower water, we actually fish the outside of the bend because that's where the food source is getting pushed, and they're not having to expend a tremendous amount of energy to stay in that position. And I generally try to fish mornings and afternoons for the reason that shadows are cast. And oftentimes we're casting to these shadows because they feel more secure. They feel as if they're hidden, and being in this ambush situation, that they're protected. They're not the brightest of things. Midday is just, it's tough, and that's when shots become critical, because the shot that you make with a fly rod has to be so close to structure midday, because they will just tuck themselves behind rocks, behind trees, anything that they can do to ambush their predators. Now, there's not a ton of knots you really need to know. However, having said that, it definitely matters. I use a non-slip loop knot, also known as kind of like a Rapala knot, because it gives the fly more action. It's also about 27% stronger than your clinch knot. So oftentimes it's a testament to the guide that it actually breaks in the loop and the knot itself doesn't break. But always take your time with knots. There's absolutely nothing worse than losing a fly on a fish and your tippet comes back all curly because you just didn't spend enough time. The clinch knot is a bit weaker, but I tend to use it on poppers because it gives me a little bit more control over that fly. I don't necessarily want that deer hair bug moving as much. I want more direct control of it. And if anyone has questions about knots, please ask. The blood knot. This is probably like every angler's like worst nightmare. It's a really finicky knot. It is just so strong. You know, it really only reduces your pulling strength by about 17%. So it's an extremely effective knot, and I'll be around and happy to show anybody how to do that. The other one is the perfection loop. It's one of the more beautiful knots in fly fishing, I think. And it's really made to use when you're using a poly leader, that sinking leader I was speaking about before, where you can make a loop-to-loop connection, or you're making your own leaders. So you really don't have to stray through that. The other thing, always lubricate your knots. I know it sounds kind of funny, but particularly when using mono, it's a very weak substance, nylon. As you pull and seed that knot, oftentimes it creates a burn. And that burn weakens the knot significantly. And if you're able to lubricate it, you'll get a much better seeded knot. So yeah, when we are fishing for smallmouth, if you're in a wading situation or in a boat, oftentimes we're making a cast 90 degrees from the bank. And the reason that we do that is that for two reasons. These fish will always be nosed upstream. Fish don't swim backwards, right? So we want to present that fly broadside to that fish so they'll make a move on it. Very, very rarely will you ever see, unless it's a super tiny fly, a Smallmouth eat from behind, because if they're eating another fish, that fish has dorsal fins, and those dorsal fins will suffocate them. So, and basically, yeah, they know better. So, yep, and yep, casting upstream. Your retrieve needs to be a little bit faster as that fly is coming towards you. And when fishing downstream, which is also an advantage, you want to strip a little bit slower. And I definitely have gone with the motto, don't just roguely retrieve the fly. I change everything up before I switch a fly. Now that's the cadence, the speed, the pauses. You know, it may be pop, pop, pop. It may be a long strip to a short strip. Really swim that fly as opposed to roguely swimming it. This is kind of an example. Hopefully. I'm really sorry, I'm not. Yep, cool. Of a shot and a retrieve. Almost. Sorry about that. I'm just gonna go back one. Oh, perfect. Thanks so much. Yeah, it doesn't seem like it wanted to save video, which is fine. Yeah, so the retrieve, again, change everything up with the retrieve before you change anything else. I promise you, you'll save money in a fly shop. You don't need this trout box and the subsequent 7 other trout boxes where flies become more complicated. Um, Change everything. Now, the hook set is a pretty critical part. We're dealing with a strip set as opposed to a trout set. Now, the reason for that is that you're constantly staying tight to that fly, and once you feel it, you hit them and then raise the rod. So I had a great video of this, but oh yeah, there we go. So you can see here, I pull and then raise the rod, and then yeah, subsequently play around with it for a bit. There's also something called a tight set. I'm really sorry about this. Oh, brother. Cool. So techniques within fighting the fish. A lot of people are eager to get these fish on the reel. It is wildly unnecessary. I can't tell you how many people I've seen in the boat blow really big fish because they were wasting time trying to pick up all this line, right? Your left hand is way more sensitive than any drag on a fly reel. So fly reels are very simplistic. Um, and the biggest thing that I talk about with clients on the boat is if you hook up into a large fish, it's important to figure out when it's their turn and when it's yours. When it's your turn, you strip, you put the stick to them. And when it's theirs, you've got to let line. But keeping tension on that line at all times is absolutely critical. Oh, these videos killing me. Handling smallmouth, man. Be polite to your buddy. I know everyone has seen like the Bassmaster and they're lipping these fish, and they look real cool, I suppose. Any larger class fish doesn't have the cartilage or bone structure to support the weight of their body vertically. You're doing damage to them when you're holding them vertically. So it's something that I learned during a tournament from a biologist, and I was like, well, I'm just going to hold them laterally forever, you know, because that's how they exist within their structure and their environment. And again, letting them go. If you hang a bass and then just kind of chuck it in the water over the side of the boat, they're very susceptible to other predators, pike in particular. Pike kind of make groceries out of bass. So it's just really important to like nurture this fish, give it time and let it swim away on its own. Pretty important. Oh, now video is working. But yeah, it's something you want them to swim away on their own. So that's kind of my spiel. I am the owner and guide of Milwaukee River Fly Fishing, and one of the things that we do is we offer float trips all the way from Wabadonia down to the urban areas near Glendale. But we run a myriad of different boats, so we're able to kind of put you guys on the right water at the right time. And those are a couple of my boats. And yeah, contact information. I've got cards and brochures. So yeah, really appreciate all you guys being here. And if anyone has any questions, I'm happy to answer them. Thank you.